Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Asylum was never meant to alleviate all problems, even all serious problems that people face every day all over the world.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions has announced domestic violence will no longer be grounds for asylum, a far-reaching shift that could affect thousands of women fleeing gender-based violence, particularly from Central America. We'll get the latest. Then we look at a stunning new United Nations report about poverty in the United States.
I think the American dream is moving fairly rapidly towards the American illusion, because social mobility in this country is now extremely low by any Western standards. If you're born in poverty, guess where you're going to end up? In poverty.
Plus, we'll speak with the Reverend William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign.
If you didn't mean what's in the Constitution, you shouldn't have written it. Loose the bands of wickedness. Stop lying and saying America doesn't have enough resources. If you can find a $2 trillion tax cut, you can find the resources for everybody to have health care and have a living wage.
Thousands have been arrested across the country protesting poverty and racism in the Trump administration. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. House Republican leaders have released a draft of an immigration bill that would vastly increase funding for a heavily militarized U.S.-Mexico border wall and sharply curtail the number of documented immigrants allowed into the United States, while providing a path to citizenship for young undocumented dreamers. The draft bill would also end the Trump administration's policy of separating migrant children from their parents. It's an apparent concession to the growing outrage over the practice, which has seen immigration and border agents rip children and even babies out of the arms of their mothers and fathers. This comes as more than 300 Catholic bishops blasted the Trump administration's immigration policies, calling for an end to the separation of migrant children from their parents and condemning Attorney General Jeff Sessions' policy of ending the right of domestic violence survivors to seek asylum in the United States.
Separating babies from their mothers is not the answer and is immoral.
That's Monsignor Brian Bransfield reading a statement issued by the National Conference of Catholic Bishops during its spring meeting this week in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
This decision negates decades of precedents that have provided protection to women fleeing domestic violence. Unless overturned, the decision will erode the capacity of asylum to save lives, particularly in cases that involve asylum seekers who are persecuted by private actors.
The bishop's statement came after the Southern Baptist Convention voted unanimously Tuesday on a resolution that includes a call to keep families together. And Reverend Franklin Graham, a Trump supporter, son of the late evangelist Billy Graham, told the Christian Broadcasting Network it's disgraceful and terrible to see families ripped apart. Responding to the outcry by church leaders, Attorney General Sessions quoted Scripture Thursday to justify his department's immigration policies. Sessions was speaking to an invitation-only crowd in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained the government for his purposes.
Critics seized on Sessions' reference to Romans 13, noting it was a favorite passage of defenders of the Confederacy used to justify slavery. At the White House, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders defended the administration's immigration policies, telling reporters, quote, "It's very biblical to enforce the law." That prompted this exchange between Trump spokesperson Sanders and reporter Brian Karem of Sentinel Newspapers.
Come on, Sarah, you're a parent. Don't you have any empathy for what these people are going through? They have less than you do.
Guys,
Sarah, come on, seriously.
I'm trying to be serious, but I'm not going to.
But you're sitting there telling us it's a law, and they have these people have nothing. They come over here with nothing. It's not that. It's not about that. It's about you answering a question, Sarah. Honestly, answer the question. It's a serious question. These people have nothing. They come to the border with nothing, and you throw children in cages. You're a parent. You're a parent of young children. Don't you have any empathy for what they go through?
Jill, go ahead.
Thursday's tense White House briefing came after CBS News reported Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her Deputy Press Secretary Raj Shah are preparing to leave their jobs. Sanders has denied the rumor. This all comes as new photos have emerged showing the inside of the former Walmart in Texas that's converted into a detention center for 1,500 migrant boys. The walls of the jail are lined with murals depicting American history and leaders, including one of President Trump with the caption in both English and Spanish reading, "Sometimes by losing a battle, you find a new way to win the war." New York's Attorney General filed suit against Donald Trump's charitable foundation Thursday, accusing the president and 3 of his children of using the nonprofit for illegal campaign activity and as a virtual piggy bank for repeated self-dealing. Among other charges, the lawsuit alleges the Trump Foundation used charitable funds to illegally coordinate with Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, to settle lawsuits against Trump family businesses, and even to purchase a $10,000 portrait of Donald Trump hung at one of Trump's golf resorts. In another case, the charity paid $32,000 to cover costs related to property owned by Trump. The suit seeks to bar Donald Trump from serving on a nonprofit board for a decade and to prevent Ivanka, Eric, and Donald Trump Jr. from similarly serving for 1 year. The lawsuit also opens the door for IRS action against the Trump family, including civil penalties and possible criminal charges. The Justice Department's top watchdog said in a scathing report released Thursday that former FBI Director James Comey was insubordinate during the 2016 presidential campaign when he took unilateral actions that could have impacted the outcome of the vote. Inspector General Michael Horowitz said in the 500-page report that Comey mishandled the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, making a, quote, serious error in judgment, unquote, by telling Congress on the eve of the election that he was reopening an investigation into whether Clinton illegally circulated classified information on a private email server. Even so, the report did not conclude Comey held a bias that influenced his decisions. The Inspector General also found at least 5 FBI officials assigned to the Clinton investigation improperly made anti-Trump or pro-Clinton statements over text messages or by other means. This is FBI Director Christopher Wray speaking Thursday after the report's release.
This report did not find any evidence of political bias or improper considerations actually impacting the investigation under review. The report does identify errors of judgment, violations of or even disregard for policy, and decisions that, at the very least, with the benefit of hindsight, were not the best choices. We've already started taking the necessary steps to address those issues.
President Trump immediately seized on the report to justify his decision to fire Comey just 6 months after Election Day. Trump tweeted, quote, Comey will now officially go down as the worst leader by far in the history of the FBI. I did a great service to the people in firing him. Good instincts, Trump tweeted. In Nicaragua, leaders of a protest movement demanding the ouster of President Daniel Ortega have called a 24-hour nationwide strike. The work stoppage came as Nicaragua's migration office said it's seen an influx of thousands of Nicaraguans desperate to leave the country as Ortega's forces and pro-government vigilantes are waging a campaign of violence that's seen at least 137 people killed since widespread protests began in April. The quadrennial World Cup kicked off in Moscow Thursday with home team Russia defeating Saudi Arabia 5-0 in the opening match of the soccer tournament. Russian President Vladimir Putin watched the match in a VIP booth with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whose military is currently executing a U.S.-backed assault on Yemen's port city of Hodeidah. As the World Cup got underway, police led veteran British LGBT rights campaigner Peter Tatchell away in handcuffs after he held a sign outside the Kremlin reading, "Putin fails to act against Chechnya torture of gay people." Human rights groups say authorities in the Russian-controlled Republic of Chechnya rounded up more than 100 gay men in Grozny last year, detained them without charge, tortured them in what many have called a gay pogrom. Argentina's lower house of Congress has approved a bill that would decriminalize abortions during the first 14 weeks of a pregnancy. News of the bill's passage sent a cheer through hundreds of pro-choice demonstrators who rallied outside the National Congress building in Buenos Aires during Thursday's vote. President Mauricio Macri has promised to sign the legislation if it's passed by the Argentine Senate. Back in the United States, book publishers reporting that Bill Clinton's new novel, The President is Missing, co-written with James Patterson, has sold more copies in its first week than any other fiction book in the past 2 years. This is despite the fact that on his highly publicized book tour, Clinton has repeatedly diminished the Me Too movement, saying he does not owe Monica Lewinsky an apology. Here is Clinton speaking on PBS last week, responding to a question about Minnesota Senator Al Franken's resignation after he was accused of sexual harassment.
I think the norms have really changed in terms of what you can do to somebody against their will, how much you can crowd their space, make them miserable at work. You don't have to physically assault somebody to make them, uncomfortable at work or at home or in their utter just walking around.
The American Medical Association has voted to take on two major public health issues, gun violence and climate change. During its annual meeting in Chicago this week, the AMA voted to support nearly a dozen gun control measures, including a ban on the sale and ownership of assault-style weapons. Former AMA President Dr. David O'Barb said in a statement, quote, "In emergency rooms across the country, the carnage of gun violence has become a too routine experience. It doesn't have to be this way, and we urge lawmakers to act," unquote. The AMA also voted this week to divest from companies that get the majority of their income from fossil fuels. Climate activist Bill McKibben celebrated the news, tweeting, quote, "The AMA is saying to the dirty fuels industry what it said to tobacco a generation ago. You're killing our patients, and we will not allow it anymore." Iowa Republican Congressmember Steve King sparked outrage this week after retweeting a racist tweet by British neo-Nazi Mark Collette, reading, quote, 65% of Italians under the age of 35 now oppose mass immigration. Europe is waking up. The tweet featured an article by Breitbart News. Mark Collette is a known white supremacist who's claimed the porn industry is a secret Jewish plot to destroy Christian families. Despite the outcry, King has not deleted his retweet and, in fact, yesterday shared the same Breitbart article again on his Twitter page. This is not Congressmember King's first white supremacist comment. Last year, he published a racist tweet in support of far-right Dutch politician Geert Wilders. In 2016, he told MSNBC white Christians have contributed more to Western civilization than any other, quote, subgroup. The U.S. Army says it will repatriate the remains of 4 Native American children who died at the government-run Carlisle Indian Industrial School they were forced to attend in Pennsylvania a century ago. Native American children were sent to the Carlisle School and similar boarding schools across the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to be, quote, Americanized. The boarding schools were designed to eliminate Native American culture, separating children from their parents and forcing them to speak English, cut their hair, and give up traditional clothing. The U.S. Army began the exhumations Thursday and will return the children's remains to their descendants in Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota by early July. And legendary civil rights leader Dorothy Cotton has died, just one day after her 88th birthday. In the 1960s, Dorothy Cotton became a close aide to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and served as director of the Citizenship Education Program at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. While she participated in many civil rights marches, including several that were menaced by Ku Klux Klansmen or racist police, Cotton often said her most important contribution was registering new voters and educating people about their citizenship rights and Black history. This is Dorothy Cotton speaking at New York City's Riverside Church in 2008.
I was really getting very concerned about people remembering Dr. King only in the context of a march. People don't even know we had a training program, the citizenship education program. Andy Young, who actually was the administrator, and we got the money, and it was funneled through his congregational church and to keep this training program going that was actually started at the Highlander Folk School. But we need, that story needs to be out there, so folk don't think we just had a march. Even on campuses, students used to say, "When are you going to have another march? When are you going to have a march?" Well, of course, I tell them now, what, do we need a march? Well, if we're going to march, you'll have to do it. My legs hurt now. I just had a hip replacement.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show looking at the Trump administration's ongoing crackdown against immigrants and asylum seekers. On Monday, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced domestic and gang-related violence will generally no longer be grounds for asylum, a far-reaching shift that could affect thousands of people, particularly women from Central America fleeing gender-based violence. On Monday, Sessions chose to reverse the Board of Immigration Appeals' grant of asylum to a Salvadoran domestic violence survivor known as A.B., who fled to the U.S. for her life after surviving 15 years of beatings, rape, and death threats from her husband. In ruling against A.B., Sessions also overturned a groundbreaking precedent from 2014 in which the Immigration Appeals Court affirmed that domestic violence survivors are deserving of protection. In that precedent-setting case, the Board of Immigration Appeals granted asylum to a Guatemalan woman named Aminta Cifuentes, who'd fled to the United States after being brutally abused by her husband for years, raped, beaten, kicked, burned with acid, and punched so hard in the stomach when she was 8 months pregnant that her child was born prematurely with bruises. As in the case of A.B., the police refused to intervene to stop the abuse Aminta Cifuentes was suffering. But on Monday, Attorney General Jeff Sessions ruled against A.B. and overturned the precedent that had granted Cifuentes asylum, ruling, quote, claims by aliens pertaining to domestic violence or gang violence perpetrated by non-governmental actors will not qualify for asylum. Immigration advocates and former immigration judges have denounced Sessions' announcement. A group of 15 former immigration judges called Sessions' move an affront to the rule of law, writing, quote, for reasons understood only by himself, the Attorney General today erased an important legal development that was universally agreed to be correct, they wrote. Well, for more, we're joined now in Berkeley, California, by Karen Musallo, professor of law, the director of the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California Hastings College of Law. She is one of the attorneys representing Ms. A.B. So talk about Attorney General Jeff Sessions' ruling on Monday, and tell us the story of your client, A.B.
Thank you, Amy, for having me on this morning. I think it's really important to look at this decision both for what it does and what it doesn't do, and maybe just to say what it purports to do. So the Attorney General is trying to signal in very strong terms to decision makers, immigration judges, and asylum officers that these types of claims don't meet the legal requirements. And there's no doubt that that is the intent behind this decision. And it's very, very concerning for many reasons. But those of us who have really read the decision closely have reached the conclusion that he is stretching. So although he, as you explained, reversed this 2014 precedent, ARCG, the case of Aminta Cifuentes, that established that domestic violence survivors could be granted asylum, he reversed that precedent. But there are there are 38 years of development of the legal definition of refugees in U.S. law, and actually under a fair application of the standard, these individuals do qualify for asylum. And the reason that I start my remarks with that is that there are many people who are just going to be bullied by Sessions, and Sessions says these are no longer legitimate cases. And as lawyers, we know a couple of things, and one thing is that every case is decided by a fair application of the law to the facts of that case. We don't rule by fiat. Sessions is not a king. He's appointed himself in this posture to decide this particular case and set this precedent, but it is up to decision makers, immigration judges, asylum officers, the Board of Immigration Appeals, to look at each case on the facts of that case. And we could go into it more, but there are many reasons why these cases will qualify for asylum under a fair application of the law to the facts.
And talk about your client, A.B. Tell us her life story.
So as you recounted, she was brutalized for more than 15 years by a man who she met, married, had 3 children with, and almost immediately after the marriage, he began to abuse her in horrific ways by, bashing her head into the wall, threatening her with guns and knives, beating her, raping her, threatening to hang her by a rope from the ceiling when she was pregnant, waking her up in the middle of the night. He would come home and just wake her up and call her a slut or a whore and other degrading, insulting terms, misogynist terms, tell her to get out of bed and cook for him. And finally, when it became too much, she separated from him and moved a distance of 2 or 3 hours away in El Salvador. But he quickly found her whereabouts, sought her out for continued mistreatment, including beatings and rape. Finally, she decided to divorce him. And immediately after the divorce, he said to her, "If you think that this frees you from me, you're sadly mistaken. You will always be mine." I should add a couple of other facts in there is that the police were repeatedly called, the Salvadoran police, were not responsive. On 2 occasions, they issued protective orders, but they actually asked her to serve the protective orders on her husband. So you can imagine that somebody who's being brutalized, threatened by a powerful man with weapons, and the police say, "Here's this piece of paper, go serve it on this person," telling him that he should leave you alone. It's just absolutely ludicrous. And on another occasion, the police said to her, "If you had any dignity, you would just leave him." And another important fact in sort of showing the government's absolute lack of response or complicity is that her brother-in-law, in other words, the abuser's brother, was a police officer. And he joined in the threats with her husband and then her ex-husband against her, saying on some occasions, you better be careful. You don't know where the bullets are going to be flying from. And also threats that she was going to end up dead, cut up, put in a plastic bag and thrown in a river. So I think after, 15 years, which included repeated attempts to get protection from the government, she made the decision that the only way to save her life was to flee. And she came to the United States seeking asylum. And Amy, if you'd like, I can also describe the very sort of bizarre and inappropriate way in which her case developed that ended up with Attorney General Sessions becoming involved.
Yes, please do, Professor Misalo.
Yes. So she had the misfortune of appearing in front of an immigration judge, Judge Stuart Couch, who is in Charlotte, North Carolina, who is notorious for his very high denial rate in asylum cases, close to 86% denial rate, which is really stratospheric. It's just so high above the national average. And he's also known for his particular hostility to claims based on domestic violence. He repeatedly denies them using the same boilerplate language and had repeatedly been reversed on appeal by the Board of Immigration Appeals. So in Miss A.B.'s case, followed that same path. He denied her asylum, first claiming that she wasn't credible, even though she had corroboration of many of the key aspects of her claim, but then saying even if she were to be credible, she didn't meet the refugee definition. And he went into his sort of very distorted understanding and application of the refugee requirements. So she appealed her case to the Board of Immigration Appeals, and the Board of Immigration Appeals reversed Judge Couch. And what the Board of Immigration Appeals said was basically these reasons for finding her not credible have no basis. They just really are absolutely clearly erroneous. And she meets the definition under the precedent of ARCG, the case of Aminta Cifuentes. She meets the refugee definition. And what the board did was went even further and said, we order you, Judge Couch, to grant her asylum. We're sending the case back to you so that the required security check can be done and a grant of asylum can be entered. Goes back to Judge Couch. He refuses to grant. He lets it sit and sit and sit and sit for months. And then there's a decision that comes down in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, in which North Carolina is part of that Circuit Court of Appeals. And it's a case that has nothing to do with domestic violence. And Judge Couch says, he seizes upon this and says, see, this shows that her case is no longer legitimate. It no longer meets the legal requirements. And he tries to send it back to the board for the board to reconsider its grant, which is sort of like a bizarre rogue thing to do. The board just ordered him to grant asylum. He tries to send it back to the board, but it actually never arrives at the board. It sort of sits in Charlotte. And then, for reasons that have yet to be explained to us, Attorney General Sessions learns about this case and exercises this regulatory right that he has to appoint himself to, it's called certifying a case to himself, where he can take any decision of the Board of Immigration Appeals, appoint himself as a judge to that case, and reach a decision on it. So he reached out. He essentially took the Board of Immigration Appeals grant of asylum to Miss A.B. And then, he took the case, and I don't remember exactly, it might have been 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, and then issued his negative decision on Monday. And one of the things, and again, if you or your listeners would want to hear a little bit more about it, when he issued his denial on Monday, it's interesting to know actually what the position of the Department of Homeland Security was on this, because generally the Department of Homeland Security argues the government's position. And so it might be interesting to just say what he did in light of what the government's own position, the DHS's own position was on this issue.
Yes, we just have 2 more minutes, but please explain and then tell us what happened specifically to Aminta from a few years ago, that case overturned, and AB, as well as where they are today.
Yes. So really quickly, the Department of Homeland Security actually tried to ask Attorney General Sessions actually not to take this case and reopen the question of whether domestic violence is a basis for asylum, and said in its brief that it was generally supportive of this precedent. So the government itself, sort of the prosecuting side, was saying, we don't think this should be disturbed, this precedent about women survivors being granted asylum. Ms. Cifuentes was granted. Her grant of asylum remains. It's not brought into question by this decision. But with Ms. A.B., this has thrown her into great anguish, because you can imagine the roller coaster of emotions from first being denied by Judge Couch and being subject to his abuse in the courtroom, then prevailing at the Board of Immigration Appeals, hearing that Judge Sessions, certified the case to himself, and then just learning on Monday about his decision, trying to deny her asylum. The battle is not over. I think ultimately we will prevail on this issue. Sessions is trying to drag us back to the dark ages of human rights and women's rights and refugee rights. But it's a battle we shouldn't have to fight in the year 2018.
And very quickly, calling domestic violence private violence and how this fits into the picture of what Sessions is also doing to migrant mothers and fathers, ripping their children away, and these children piling up in detention centers along the border as their mothers are sent as far away as to prisons in Washington state. These are people who have not been convicted of any crime. The children as young as infants, children, teenagers.
Yeah, Amy, there are no words to describe the kind of cruelty, just the kind of cruelty that is exhibited by this administration in its policies that are just horrific and are beyond what one could conceptualize that any decent-feeling human being could even think about. It's unimaginable what is being done, the trauma to these women and children. And then, to go to the point that you asked about characterization of domestic violence as just a private crime, this is what I meant when I said earlier that he's trying to drag us back to sort of the dark ages of human rights and women's rights, refugee rights. There used to be this division of what happened in sort of the public arena by the government was a human rights violation. But what happened in the so-called private sphere, the home or society to women, wasn't a matter for human rights. But we, under the banner of women's rights or human rights, we erase that artificial distinction. Whether a woman is tortured, whether a person is tortured in the public square or in the home, it is torture. Whether she's persecuted in the public sphere or in the home, it is persecution and she qualifies for asylum. And so he is trying to drag us back to a time period when women's rights or children's rights, LGBTQ rights were not recognized. And individuals who were victims and survivors of egregious harms were not protected. And this is what we have to fight against. And I think he is going against the tide of history and that we will prevail. And I hope people don't lose heart. We've seen a lot of people standing up in very strong ways, really, sort of joining with this against this horrific policy of family separation. And I think we just need to keep the movement going and keep the opposition and the resistance strong. And ultimately, we will be able to turn back these policies.
Karen Musiello, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. She's one of the attorneys in the case of Ms. Abey. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at a report on extreme poverty in the United States and the movement that's growing around the country, inheriting the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, the Poor People's Campaign that's seen thousands of people arrested over the last weeks all over the United States, led by the guest we'll have on today, Reverend William Barber, who was arrested this past Monday, and led as well by Reverend Liz Theoharis, who was also arrested in front of the Supreme Court. We'll be speaking with Philip Alston, the author of the report, as well. Stay with us.
Explain it to me. Explain it to me. Explain it to me again. Though I know all about the words you're spitting out, the floor is yours without a doubt. I already know this is gonna go. This is gonna go.
Explain Things to Me by Taco Cat here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. A group of top Democrats are demanding the Trump administration present a plan to Congress to address mounting levels of poverty in the United States, following an excoriating report by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. In the letter sent to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, Senators Bernie Sanders of Vermont, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, and other top lawmakers write, quote, "We believe the massive levels of deprivation outlined in the report, as well as the intense levels of suffering this deprivation causes, are an affront to any notion of the inalienable rights to live, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," unquote. This comes after United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, slammed the Trump administration's policies for worsening the state of poverty in the United States. The report states the policies pursued over the past year seem deliberately designed to remove basic protections from the poorest, punish those who are not in employment, and make even basic health care into a privilege to be earned rather than a right of citizenship. The report details how 40 million Americans live in poverty and 18.5 million Americans live in extreme poverty. It also details how the United States has the highest rate of income inequality among Western countries and one of the lowest rates of intergenerational social mobility. Joining us here in New York is Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. He'll be presenting his report next week in Geneva. Welcome to Democracy Now! Lay out your findings.
Well, I was looking at two different aspects in a way. One is what you've described now. In other words, the economic statistics, the extent to which vast numbers of people are left living without enough to get by on, the 40 million living in poverty, the figure of 5.3 million, which has been estimated of people who live in, quote, third world conditions in this country. And you've got a trend which is designed to, in terms of policies being adopted and put forward by the current administration, to...
You call them aggressively regressive.
Yes. Basically, they are singling out all of the major benefit programs and seeking to attach very harsh work requirements to it. We're all in favour of people having to work, but in the vast majority of cases, people are already working and they can't survive. But that's not going to stop cutbacks in food stamps, cutbacks in housing subsidies, and various other programs. But the other thing that my report looks at, which is equally important, is the threat to democracy, of course. That if you consistently make life less manageable for those who are living in poverty, if you start to cut back on those who are able to vote, if you start making it more difficult, the latest Supreme Court decision in relation to Ohio, making it feasible for the states to eliminate lots of voters, all of these affect overwhelmingly those who are not wealthy. And that means that the assault in economic terms represents a major threat to the democracy. So my report focuses then on the implications of this for what we call civil and political rights in the United States.
Where did you go?
I went to California, I went to Alabama, West Virginia, Puerto Rico, and Atlanta, as well as Washington, D.C.
You point out that the life expectancy in the United States, in the most, what many consider the most industrialized country in the world, the life expectancy rates are falling.
Yes, the World Health Organization brought out new statistics just a week or so ago, which showed, and this is a complex figure, it showed that the healthy life expectancy, in other words, the number of years that a newborn can expect to live in health, is now lower in the United States than it is in China. This is a pretty shocking development because life expectancy is the classic overall indicator of the well-being of a society. It brings together a lot of different factors, why people live long, why they die early, and so on. And so what you've got in the United States, despite the massive spending on healthcare, etc., is the worst level of healthcare in the Western world. the highest levels of child poverty and so on, and that they all manifest themselves in the reducing life expectancy.
Philip Alston, the U.S. is the only country in the world not to have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child?
Yes, the only one.
The only country in the world.
It's quite an achievement.
And how does that relate to extreme poverty in the United States?
Well, children, of course, are an essential part of this. Of the 40 million Americans living in poverty, 13 million of those are children. We saw earlier this year in Congress a big battle over the Child Health Insurance Program, which gives...
That's CHIP.
CHIP, exactly, gives Medicaid and other assistance to children. If that had indeed been eliminated, it would have resulted in millions of children being made far worse off. So the fact that the United States says we're not going to acknowledge that children have rights, we're not going to acknowledge the universally accepted list of human rights, then makes it much easier not to single out children, not to try to guarantee minimum levels of well-being to those children. So I think it is deeply problematic, and I think it would be very good if the United States were to look at itself and say, why is it that we are the only country in the entire world that doesn't accept the notion that children have human rights?
And how do migrant children being ripped from the arms of their parents fit into the story?
Well, of course, that's a violation of the parents' rights, because there's a right for a family to remain unified. That right has been upheld across the world in all sorts of courts and jurisdictions. But the other element, obviously, is that the child also has a whole set of rights that are being violated by this sort of conduct.
So you're going to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva to present your report. You've sent it already to the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. Has she responded? Has Trump responded? And what is going to be your main point in Geneva?
Right. Well, the UN Human Rights Council looks at reports about a whole range of countries around the world in relation to different human rights. The United States itself weighs in very heavily in a lot of those debates. It will say that what's happening in China is terrible, that what's happening in Yemen is terrible. Whatever the country is that the US wants to criticize, it will be actively involved. The presentation of my report means that there's a whole range of other countries that will then get to reflect on the United States' own record. And of course, that puts the US in a difficult position. It wants to be able to speak out about human rights. It wants to be the champion of respecting humanity, dignity, and so on. But if it then has to defend itself based on an analysis that shows the pretty dire situation of a large percentage of the American population, it's not so easy. So the United States will have the opportunity to respond to my report. So far, they've chosen not to say anything. Maybe that's legitimate, and maybe they're holding their fire, as it were, until next Thursday when I present to the Human Rights Council. But I think it is extremely important, and the US itself would say this in relation to other countries, that there is a response, that there is a dialogue in the UN context around these issues.
I wanted to ask you two other questions. One, about how Puerto Rico fits into this picture, and two, about taxation.
Okay. Well, Puerto Rico would be the poorest state in the Union if it were a state. Puerto Rico doesn't, of course, have any vote in Congress, and so what we see is that it then enjoys all of the rights that someone who doesn't have a vote has. None. So consistently, the administration has adopted approaches to Puerto Rico which has made their struggle against extreme poverty almost impossible. You've currently got a situation where the PROMESA, the board that's been appointed to oversee the bankruptcy, is empowered to take all sorts of decisions, has no particular consciousness of what we call social protection issues. And so Puerto Rico is uniquely badly off in the overall U.S. context.
And taxation, how that fits into this issue of extreme poverty.
What's interesting in the overall debate is that in the good old days, FDR, LBJ and many since, there were lots of public discussions about what the United States should do about people living in poverty. What's the policy going to be in terms of the Great Society and so on? Today, there's almost no debate, certainly within this administration, about those issues. And instead, all the focus moves over to tax policy. Now, tax policy is arcane. It's very hard to understand, even for those of us who study it very carefully. But tax policy is being used as a way to shift massive resources to the wealthy, to the best-off corporations, and away from the people who really need it. And, of course, the tax cuts are being paid for in part by some of the savings that the administration has consistently predicted will come from less people on food stamps, less people getting housing subsidies, and so on.
Finally, 30 seconds on the power of the movements. We're about to speak with Reverend Barber, who was just arrested once again. There have been over 2,000 arrests around the country just in the last weeks in part of the Poor People's Campaign, moral revival. The effects of movements like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Poor People's Campaign.
It's the only way forward when governments are not interested in the plight of many millions of people. And we're not, unfortunately, I keep talking about extreme poverty, but 40 million people is not extreme poverty. 40 million people are people who are very average working class people, not able to live decent lives. The only way that's going to change is through a mass movement.
Philip Alston, we want to thank you for being with us. UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He's been researching extreme poverty and human rights in the U.S. Will be reporting his findings next week to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva on Thursday. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Reverend Barber himself, just recently arrested once again. He'll join us to talk about this last week of the beginning of the launch of the Poor People's Movement, leading to a major march in Washington on June 23rd. Stay with us. All these governors by the evens. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The release of the UN report on extreme poverty in the United States comes amidst a nationwide weeks-long direct action campaign known as the new Poor People's Campaign, aimed at fighting poverty and racism in the United States. Nearly 2,000 people have been arrested across the country since the campaign began in March. This comes 50 years after the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. launched the first Poor People's Campaign and was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. Organizers say the Poor People's Campaign is the most expansive wave of nonviolent direct action in the U.S. this century. Well, Democracy Now! Was in the streets of Washington, D.C., covering the Poor People's Campaign Monday as over 100 people were arrested in D.C. alone. This is the Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, speaking before he was arrested.
We believe we got to shift the narrative of this country, and the only way we can do it is people have got to put their lives and their bodies on the line. You have preachers and poor people and impacted people who are in these lines. And we're willing now to engage in an act of moral civil disobedience to drive home what is going on. We believe that injustice is happening in the halls of Congress and in the halls of state capitals around this country.
Just after he said this, Reverend Barber was taken into custody, was arrested along with 100 other people. Just after they were detained across the street at the Supreme Court, his co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Liz Theoharis, with 8 other religious leaders and activists, were standing on the steps of the Supreme Court. They, too, were arrested. They were held overnight in cockroach-infested cells like so many others are held. When they were brought before the judge the next day, they were in ankle irons. Joining us now from Chicago is the Reverend Dr. William Barber as he campaigns around the country against poverty and racism. Reverend Barber, it's great to see you again. Talk about what happened Monday and where you're headed now as we bring out this latest report on extreme poverty. You expand that to poverty, all poor people in this country.
Indeed, and thank you so much, Amy, for having us on this morning. And on behalf of my co-chair, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, and the activists and devotees in over 40 states around this country. There were actions last Monday in over 40 states simultaneously at 2 o'clock. Actually, the numbers have gone up now. Over 2,000 persons have engaged in nonviolent moral fusion civil disobedience. And thousands have committed and been witnesses and planning to come on June 23rd to D.C. You know, when we had those people arrested in Washington, it happened, and it was happening across this country because we've done a study called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America 50 years after the first Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign, a national call revival audit, says there are actually 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. 73% of them are women and children. That's 43.5% of all of the people in this country are poor. Upwards of 250,000 people die every year from poverty. Incomes and low. It's no longer true that if you work, you're coming out of poverty. In some places, you'd have to work 99 hours at a minimum wage job just to be able to get a basic apartment. So we have an impoverished democracy right now. It didn't just start with Trump, but it certainly is being exacerbated by Trump. Too often we have seen a political dialogue, a narrative for the last 40 years that has literally removed poverty from any of our political discussions. Politicians talk about the middle class and military and not about poverty. And we have this impoverished democracy. On top of that, we have, Amy, this systemic racism. Particularly around the works, not the words of racism, like Roseanne Barr saying something, but the works of racism, voter suppression that hurts the poor, gerrymandering that hurts the poor, and allows people to get elected who use racialized voter suppression to get elected. And once they get elected, they pass policies that hurt mostly the poor. All of the states that have racialized voter suppression since 2010 have elected state houses and Congress people and senators that are against funding for the poor, that are against living wages, that have tried to block health care, that have passed tax cuts that are devastating to the programs that help the poor. So we have an impoverished democracy, which is why we have to have massive nonviolent moral fusion civil disobedience, massive voter mobilization among the poor, and massive power building among the poor if we're going to turn this nation around.
You've talked about a basic guaranteed income, which Dr. King also spoke about. The mayor of Stockton, California, Michael Tubbs, is planning a pilot project which would give $500 to some residents as a guaranteed income. Why is this so important to you?
Well, first of all, for me as a person of faith and a person of deep religious values and even my constitutional values, there's some things that we are supposed to be about. The scriptures say, woe unto those who rob the poor of their right and make women and children their prey. It also says we're supposed to care for the least of these. And our Constitution says we're supposed to establish justice and provide for the general welfare. We live in a country now where we're treating corporations like people and people like things. We live in a country where we say banks are too big to fail, but then we let human beings fail. We cannot deal with poverty if we do not deal with wages. It is as though we give corporate welfare to corporations.
We make sure everything else survives. But then when it comes to poor people, it's almost as though we can write them off. They are hurting people. They are disabled people. I think about Pamela Rush, who's down in Loudoun County, who was tricked by predatory lenders and made to buy spend $120,000 for a one-room trailer that's now falling apart, is mold infested. Her daughter is now on a CPAP machine. She's disabled. Her daughter is disabled, and she has raw sewage coming up in the back of her yard. She should have a guaranteed basic income. She should have a guaranteed basic income to survive. Because the system did so much to her to cause her life to be so miserable. And there are many, many more people. Just like health care should be guaranteed as a human right. It should not just be for those who can't afford it or those that some say can deserve it. We have 37 million people in this country without health care. Without health care, for every 1 million people without health care, over 5,000 people die, literally die. In the wealthiest country in the nation, in the country with the most advanced health, and we are the one of the 25 wealthiest country, and we're the only one that does not provide some form of guaranteed universal health care. These things are immoral, and as Joseph Stiglitz says, the Nobel Peace Prize economist, not only are they immoral, we have to look at the cost of inequality. It is costing us people, it is costing us our moral fiber, and it is doing great injury to our democracy.
I wanted to get your comment on the separating of children from their parents, the imprisoning of migrant children. More than 300 Catholic bishops have blasted the Trump administration's immigration policies, calling for the separation of their children from their parents, condemning Attorney General Jeff Sessions' policy of ending the right of domestic violence survivors to seek asylum here in the U.S. On Thursday, Sessions quoted the Bible to justify the Trump administration policies. He was speaking to an invitation-only crowd in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This is what he said.
I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government because God has ordained the government for his purposes.
Critics seized on Sessions' reference to Romans 13, noting it was a favorite passage of defenders of the Confederacy used to justify slavery. Reverend Barber, your thoughts?
That's why another reason why we've got to get in the streets, why we've got to have this massive nonviolent moral civil disobedience. Clergy and others have to come out of our sanctuaries. People have to come into the street because this administration seems to be the administration of meanness. It decided to be the administration of lies. And now it's being the administration of theological heresy. And I don't just blame Sessions. I blame the Congress people that are not challenging him, the extreme so-called Christian nationalists that will be quiet on this kind of stuff, who probably sent him that scripture. Let me just say this, Amy. First of all, he's misinterpreting that text. Paul actually was arrested by the government because Christians challenged the government. That's one of the reasons Paul ends up getting killed. So that's the first thing. Second of all, the Bible is clear from the Old Testament to the New Testament that one of God's primary concerns is that we care for the stranger, that we do not rob children of their rights and mothers of their children, that we welcome the stranger and make sure that the stranger, the immigrant, the undocumented person is treated like a brother or sister. You cannot find anywhere where Jesus or the prophets would say anything like what Sessions said. Now, he is operating from a playbook. That's the same kind of heresy that was used to support the genocide of Native Americans. It's the same kind of biblical heresy that was used to support slavery and used to support Jim Crow. It's the law. And that's why movements broke it. As remember, Dr. King said, any law that's against God's law and against the law of justice, we have a responsibility to challenge that law. America has a long history of having laws that do not line up with the moral demands of our Constitution.
Reverend Barber, we have to wrap the show. June 23rd, what's happening? You have 10 seconds.
Come June 23rd on the west side of the Capitol in the lawn, 10 o'clock, we're having a massive call to action, the final launch of the 40 days of this campaign. We will continue to bring everybody you know. The people will be speaking. We will be talking about what we do going forward, but we will not turn around. Somebody's hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, thanks so much for being with us. This breaking news, the Trump administration is reportedly withdrawing the U.S. from the UN's Human Rights Council. Reuters reports the decision is imminent. That does it for the broadcast. We want to thank the Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis, Diener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.